1.5 billion pounds. Even by today's standards, that's a lot of copper. That one number has followed the story of ancient copper mining around Lake Superior for more than 60 years. That's 750,000 tons. If prehistoric miners really remove that much copper, then the obvious question is almost impossible to ignore. Where did it all go? It is an archaeological fact that prehistoric miners extracted copper from the Lake Superior region on a significant scale. Thousands of years ago, indigenous people were extracting native copper there. Archaeologists have documented ancient mining pits, stone tools, copper artifacts, and radiocarbon evidence tied to that activity. And modern science has added something else. Sediment studies from Isle Royale have found geochemical evidence consistent with ancient copper mining thousands of years ago. So there is really no doubt that prehistoric mining took place. The question is how large that scale actually was. How much copper was actually removed? And where did the famous figure of 750,000 tons come from in the first place? In 1961, Roy Ward Dreyer and Octave J. Du Temple published a calculation attempting to estimate how much copper prehistoric miners may have removed from the Lake Superior region. Their method was straightforward. Estimate the number of ancient mining pits. Estimate the average size of those pits. Estimate how much material was removed from each one. Then estimate how much copper that material contained. Using one set of assumptions, they arrived at roughly 1 billion pounds of copper. Using a higher set of assumptions, the total climbed to about 1.5 billion pounds. That gave us the famous figure of 750,000 tons. That number is dramatic, but it's also important to understand what it isn't. It is not the result of archaeologists weighing recovered copper. It is not the result of measuring every ancient mining pit. And it is not a direct archaeological measurement of how much copper prehistoric miners actually removed. It is a calculation built from estimates. Dreyer and Du Temple assumed roughly 5,000 ancient mining pits. They also used an average pit size of about 20 feet across and 30 feet deep. From there, they estimated roughly 1,000 to 1,200 tons of material removed from each pit, along with an assumed percentage of copper in that material. Multiply those numbers together and you can reach an enormous total very quickly. But the size of the final answer depends entirely on the quality of the numbers you started with. If the pits were generally shallower than the assumed average, the calculated amount falls. If the number of pits was lower, it falls again. If the average concentration of recoverable copper was lower, it falls again. And if more than one of those assumptions is off at the same time, the effect compounds. That is the difference between a calculation being mathematically correct and the result being archaeologically reliable. So how solid were the numbers going into the calculation? This is where the famous number begins to get shaky. The first problem is the number of mining pits. Dreyer and Du Temple used an estimate of roughly 5,000 ancient pits, but that was not the result of archaeologists conducting a complete survey and counting 5,000 individual mines. It was an estimate. And when you're trying to calculate hundreds of thousands of tons of copper, that distinction matters. The second problem is pit size. Their calculation assumed an average pit about 20 feet across and 30 feet deep. But ancient mining pits were not uniform holes cut to standard dimensions. They varied considerably in size and depth. That means an assumed average can have an enormous effect on the final calculation. Imagine reducing the average depth from 30 feet to 15. You haven't changed the number of pits at all, but you've just dramatically reduced the amount of material the calculation says was removed. Then, there is the copper itself. Native copper deposits around Lake Superior are not evenly distributed through the rock. Some workings could encounter rich concentrations of copper, while others could contain much less. So assigning a single copper percentage to thousands of different pits introduces another layer of uncertainty. And this is the central problem. Each estimate feeds into the next estimate. The estimated number of pits is multiplied by an estimated average pit size. That result is multiplied by an estimated amount of material. Then that is multiplied by an estimated copper concentration. None of that means the calculation was dishonest. Dreyer and Du Temple were attempting to put a number on something that was and still is extraordinarily difficult to quantify. The problem comes when the result is repeated without the assumptions attached to it. 750,000 tons sounds like somebody measured 750,000 tons. They didn't. It is the upper result of a chain of assumptions. And decades after Dreyer and Du Temple published their estimate, a professional archaeologist took a much harder look at those assumptions. That archaeologist was Susan R. Martin. Martin specialized in the archaeology of ancient copper mining in Michigan, and in 1995 she published a paper examining what researchers could actually say with confidence about prehistoric copper production. She addressed the huge production estimates directly. Her problem was not with the existence of ancient mining. That was never in doubt. Her problem was with the arithmetic used to turn uncertain evidence into an apparently precise total. Martin pointed out that the number of mining pits was uncertain. Their average dimensions were uncertain. The amount of copper contained in the material removed from those pits was uncertain. And even the relationship between the size of a pit and the amount of copper successfully recovered from it was not something archaeologists could simply assume. When those uncertain values are multiplied together, the uncertainty does not disappear. It grows. That is why Martin rejected the idea that calculations like Dreyer and Du Temple's could establish how much copper prehistoric miners actually removed. And that distinction matters. She was not saying that ancient miners could not have produced enormous quantities of copper. She was saying that the archaeological evidence did not allow researchers to calculate that quantity with anything close to the precision suggested by figures like 1 billion or 1.5 billion pounds. Independent researcher Dave Johnson later reached a similar conclusion while examining the old estimates. But Martin's criticism carries particular weight because it came from within professional archaeology and focused directly on what the evidence could and could not support. So by this point, we have two very different ideas that are often blended together. The first is well supported. Ancient people mined copper around Lake Superior on a remarkable scale. The second is much less certain, that they removed exactly or even approximately 750,000 tons. And this is where we have to be careful not to make the opposite mistake. Questioning the figure of 750,000 tons does not mean minimizing what prehistoric miners actually accomplished. The archaeological record makes that clear. Ancient miners around Lake Superior worked native copper for thousands of years. They opened pits. They removed rock. They used stone tools. They shaped copper into weapons, tools, ornaments, and other objects. And copper from the region moved far beyond the mines themselves. Modern scientific evidence has strengthened that picture. Sediment studies from Isle Royale have found geochemical traces consistent with ancient copper mining thousands of years ago. That matters because it gives us a line of evidence that does not depend on the old tonnage calculation at all. The ancient mining leaves a physical signature of its own. So the mining was real, the scale was significant, and the people doing it were capable of sustained, organized extraction over very long periods of time. What the evidence does not give us is a trustworthy total. That means we have to separate two very different statements. The first is that prehistoric copper mining around Lake Superior was extensive. That is supported. The second is that prehistoric miners removed 750,000 tons of copper. That is not established by the archaeological evidence we have. Could they have removed that much? Possibly. Could the true amount have been far lower? Of course. The problem is that the evidence does not allow us to calculate the answer with confidence. So the responsible conclusion is not that 750,000 tons is impossible. It is that the famous number is far less certain than the way it is usually presented. And once we recognize that, the biggest mystery in the story begins to change. Which brings us back to the question that started this investigation. Where did all the copper go? At least some of it is not missing at all. Copper mined around Lake Superior was fashioned into tools, weapons, ornaments, and other objects. Those objects did not necessarily remain beside the mines where the copper originated. Copper moved. It was carried, exchanged, traded, reshaped, and distributed across large distances. That part of the story is firmly rooted in archaeology. But there is a much larger problem hiding inside the question. Where did all the copper go? The question assumes that we already know how much copper there was, and we don't. If prehistoric miners really removed 750,000 tons of copper, then yes, we would be dealing with an extraordinary quantity of material. We would reasonably want to know where it went. We might expect an enormous archaeological footprint. And when that footprint seems difficult to find, the absence itself can begin to look mysterious. That is where speculation enters the story. Maybe the copper was shipped somewhere else. Maybe it crossed an ocean. Maybe it supplied civilizations far removed from North America. Those possibilities make for fascinating stories, and some of those claims can be investigated on their own terms. But they cannot begin with 750,000 tons, as though that quantity has already been established. Before we try to explain the disappearance of that much copper, we first have to establish that it was actually mined. And that is precisely where the evidence becomes uncertain. The famous number did not come from finding hundreds of thousands of tons of missing copper and then trying to explain where it went. It came from a calculation. A calculation built from estimated numbers of pits, estimated pit dimensions, estimated quantities of excavated material, and estimated concentrations of copper. If those estimates are wrong, then the mystery built on top of them changes dramatically. This does not mean that every theory involving ancient copper movement beyond the Lake Superior region is automatically false. Each claim has to stand or fall on its own evidence. But the figure of 750,000 tons cannot be used as proof that some enormous missing stockpile must have gone somewhere unexpected. That would be circular reasoning. First, we assume an enormous amount of copper was mined. Then we notice that we cannot account for an enormous amount of copper. Then we use its apparent absence as evidence that it must have been carried somewhere else. But if the original quantity was never established, the disappearance has not been established either. And that may be the most important point in this entire story. There is a difference between something being unexplained and something never having been demonstrated in the first place. Prehistoric copper mining around Lake Superior is real. The ancient pits are real. The artifacts are real. The scientific evidence of mining is real. The uncertainty begins when we try to turn all of that evidence into one enormous number. So perhaps the question is not simply, where did the copper go? Perhaps the better question is, how much copper are we actually trying to account for? And right now, archaeology does not give us a reliable answer. That leaves us with a different mystery. And in some ways, it may be more interesting than the one we started with. How did 750,000 tons become such a durable number? Dreyer and Du Temple were trying to answer a legitimate question. Ancient miners clearly removed a great deal of material from the Lake Superior region. Trying to estimate the amount of copper they recovered was a reasonable thing to attempt. The problem came later. An estimate began to take on the appearance of a measurement. 1.5 billion pounds sounds remarkably precise. 750,000 tons sounds even more concrete. Numbers do that. Once a number becomes attached to a story, it can be repeated in books, articles, documentaries, websites, and conversations. And every repetition can make the number feel a little more established. Eventually, people stop asking where it came from. It simply becomes part of the story. And there is another reason numbers like this are powerful. They give a mystery scale. A missing object is interesting. 750,000 missing tons sounds extraordinary. Once the number becomes the foundation of the story, every theory built to explain it inherits that sense of scale. But if the foundation is uncertain, all of those later questions have to be reconsidered. When we followed this particular number backward, we did not find a prehistoric inventory. We did not find 750,000 tons of copper that had somehow vanished from an archaeological warehouse. We found a calculation. And when professional archaeologist Susan Martin examined the kind of assumptions behind that calculation, she argued that the variables were simply too uncertain to produce a reliable total. The number of pits was uncertain. Their average dimensions were uncertain. The amount of copper in the excavated material was uncertain, and multiplying uncertain values together did not make them certain. At the same time, Modern research has given us no reason to dismiss the ancient mining itself, quite the opposite. Archaeology and geochemical evidence continue to show that people were mining native copper around Lake Superior thousands of years ago. They did it repeatedly. They did it successfully. And they did it on a scale significant enough to leave traces that researchers can still detect today. That is remarkable, without adding anything to it. We do not have to choose between two extremes. We do not have to accept 750,000 tons as established fact. And we do not have to pretend ancient copper mining was insignificant simply because that number is questionable. The evidence allows us to say something more careful and probably more interesting. Prehistoric people carried out extensive copper mining around Lake Superior for thousands of years. Exactly how much copper they removed remains unknown. 750,000 tons may be possible. It may also be wildly high. At this point, we simply do not have the evidence to know. And that is where this investigation leaves us. Not with a solved mystery, but with a better question. Because before we ask where 750,000 tons of ancient copper disappeared to, we should probably ask whether 750,000 tons ever disappeared at all. The ancient mines are real. The copper is real. The achievement is real. But the number, that is still an estimate. But sometimes the most interesting part of a mystery is discovering that it may not be a mystery at all.